Hey guys, Rob here with Precision Raceworks. We're going to work on one of our other company's products today, showing how to install the N54 or N55 port injection kit. This kit will work on both N54 and N55 motors that are in any of the BMW vehicles, but today we're going to be installing this kit on a BMW E93. So let's jump in here and get started. Alright, so the first thing you're going to want to do is remove the cowl cover off of your car. This cover here, this customer, he has a two-piece setup. This cover is already off, so we're not going to show that. But later on, you'll see us go over and remove the other half of the cowl cover and get it out of the way. But for now, all we need to do is remove the engine cover. This kit here, we've got, or this car here, we've got two 5mm bolts, factory bolts in here. I'm going to loosen that one up, take it out. We're going to take this one out. Your car might have the rear two bolts in. Still, this car does not have those bolts anymore. So for his car, we're just simply going to undo those two, lift up. I like putting my fingers up over the top of these bolts so they don't bounce out, and just kind of work the cover out. Now that we got the engine cover off, the next thing we need to do here is remove this part of the factory air intake system. To do that, we use a T20 Torx bit. We undo the screws on each side here. Set them aside in place, but you won't lose them. You can take and grab a hold here if you got the factory air box, pull this way, and just slide up and out, and you got that cover out. Alright, for the next step here, we need to remove that other cowl section we talked about. You'd probably have the factory cowl, and you'd want to remove the whole thing all at once. But for this customer's car, he had a two-piece cowl, so we're just removing the other half of this. So we're popping the cover off here. I'm going to take that and set it around over to the side. And we got an 8mm screw here. So we loosen that screw up. Pop this little rubber tab back, and we remove the cowl. With that cowl removed, we can start moving on to disconnecting some of the other things. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this vacuum line here. You pinch on both sides, push down as you pinch, and then lift up, and it'll come right off. I don't know if you could hear that sound there, but you could hear a vacuum noise. That's a great thing. It's a sign of a healthy vacuum system without any vacuum leaks for the vacuum pump side. So that's a good thing. You want to hear that. Next step is going to be removing this air box. Your air box setup might be a little bit different, but let's dive in here and get this one taken care of. So this one looks like 8mm. We're going to give that a shot. And sure enough, he's got 8mm on his hose clamps, so we don't even have to switch tools. So we're going to loosen up those hose clamps, and we're going to see what it takes to get this out of here. So first, we're going to try to see if we can wiggle it out. This is, like I said, a little bit different air box setup than what we're used to seeing. Alright, so now we got that side out. We're going to lift this one out of the intake here. Alright, just about off. I'm going to watch that clamp so it doesn't pop out. We're up there. And now we start working off this rear section and slide it out. So for a few of these next steps, I like using a flathead screwdriver. It's a pretty good universal tool. I can stick it up underneath the edge of the map sensor here. I can pull it out and disconnect it. I can use it to pull my charge pipe clip out of here and get it up and out of the way. I can use it, if need be, to release the plastic clips around the intake manifold here for the wiring. You can unclip this. I like just taking and pushing the push-through tabs back under. I find it ends up being easier on me, and there's less chances of me breaking stuff. We've got these electrical connector here for a coolant temp sensor. Got our wiring disconnected there. Alright, so on his car he's got a towel blow-off valve here running over to a tapped port. So we're going to take a screwdriver and kind of slide it behind the silicone here to help it come off, and just kind of work our way around it. Alright, so now we got the vacuum line disconnected. We'll reach underneath and get the vacuum line that goes to the throttle body here. For that, there's a rubber portion back here at the back that's got a mount, and then you've got your clip. Push in and then release, and it'll come off of both of them, and you'll have it loose. So now we've got our sensor disconnected, our wiring here, our charge pipe. We're going to take the charge pipe and wiggle it and push down to get it off the throttle body. Oh wait, you got, oh. All right, now let's pop loose off the throttle body. All right, so now with the charge pipe down, you can see we got a little bit of slack here. We're going to move on to the 4 10mm bolts that hold the throttle body to the intake manifold. For that, I like using a small 1/4 inch drive, 10mm deep socket, and a small ratchet. And I start with the back screws. Once you get it started loosening, you can take the socket by hand, stick it up on there, and you can start backing that 10mm bolt out. Once you got it pretty loose, put the socket back on. Repeat the same thing for the other back bolt. For this step, you may find, depending on your charge pipe, that you need to push down on it or even move it some out of the way. With that one broke loose, we take the socket again just in our hand, start working that bolt out. I'm going to take this bolt completely out now. Let's move on to these top two. It doesn't matter which order you do these two in, but I recommend loosening them till they're good and loose, and then once again using your hands to take them out the rest of the way. For this step, I'll pull the charge pipe down, lift the throttle body up, and the throttle body will end up sliding out from in between the two. All right, so now with the throttle body pulled out, you can flip it over and you can see this connector here. This back side is where the locking mechanism is. I face it down, I take and I pinch, push in, and pull up. And if it won't separate nice and easily, sometimes you got to use a screwdriver and just wiggle a screwdriver in there to get it. So let me do that. I'm going to grab a screwdriver real quick and we'll get that connector off. So with the screwdriver, I can come in on the back side there, simply lift the latch up, and stick the screwdriver in between here and just push and it pops right off. Nice and easy. The next thing that's still holding this, other than the bolts to the cylinder head, is going to be the electronics container down here. To take this off, simply reach down and grab. You're going to wiggle a little bit, pull, and it'll pop right off. And now that's disconnected. All right, so now we got everything disconnected there. This car's already got the wiring. So you got a sensor up in here, or excuse me, it's a heater up in here. The wiring comes down and there's a push pin that goes to a metal bracket there. If yours isn't off like this one already is, you simply pop that loose and it comes off. So now everything's free from the intake manifold. All we got left is the bolts. Let's yank those bolts out real quick. So let's go through here and start taking these 11mm bolts out one at a time. Be careful as you do this because they'll stick to your socket and then they fall down. I try to make sure they stay hanging on the bolts. If you notice, I started in the center and I'm working my way to the outside. That's to release pressure in the middle first so you don't end up possibly stripping anything. All right, so now what we need to do is get that rear one out. So for that one, sometimes you need a swivel. It just really depends. Just be mindful of it as you do it and it'll come off. Remember, they like to fall. So once again, make sure it either stays or you pull it out with your fingers. So I kind of held on to it and now I'm going to pull it out that way. It's always a good idea to pick these up with a magnet tool, but you can use your fingers as well. And it's time to remove the intake manifold. So for removal of the intake manifold, simply lift up straight. If you've got the original factory inlet system, you're going to need to push back hard on the plastic, or you can go ahead and remove the studs. Your choice. I've done a ton of these and I can push back on the plastic. The silicone ones are going to be really easy. You just pull up, be mindful of your wiring and vacuum hoses here, push them around the intake manifold, turn it, lift up, pull out. All right, so for the next part of this, we're going to need to remove the factory intake manifold studs and install the black market parts stainless steel studs that are included with the kit so that they're a little bit longer and everything fits like we need it to. So let's go ahead and get started. To do that, we're going to use an E6 E-Torx and unscrew the factory studs. All right, so we're just going to finish pulling this last bolt out the rest of the way by hand. What you can see here, if you look, this is the factory stud in the rear and the upgraded BMP stud in the front. So it's full stainless steel. It still has the same E-Torques up top, and that'll give us the extra distance that we need. So for those, you're going to put the E-Torque side up and just hand thread all of them in to get it started. Now if you notice, we didn't put a lot of effort in when we were removing the factory studs. These things are not torqued down. They do not need to be torqued down. And if you notice right now, I'm not torquing them down. I'm taking it nice and easy, running it down till they're snug, and then stopping. That last one we can't get, as we couldn't get before. So we're going to switch back over to a handheld wrench. Alright, so while we were off camera, what we did is pretty straightforward. All we did is we installed the O-rings here in the port injection plate. We also attached the fuel hose to the center section, so that was the only section that should be without a plug. So you should have a plug in each one of these positions as it ships. You put that on there, tighten this down just a little bit, and you're good to go. So now the next step is just slipping this thing in and putting it on the car. Oop. Helps if we flip it over the right direction where the O-rings face the cylinder head. So for that, we'll slide it behind. He's got this upgraded inlet system on his car, so it's a little bit tighter fit than it'll probably be on yours. We slip it in here, line it up on the studs, and then slide it down. Alright, so now we got that on there, we simply slide it down. I'm sure you can imagine how much easier the studs make putting that portion on than it would be trying to manage the intake manifold and bolts and all that kind of stuff while you're putting it on. So that's what part of what makes the BMP kit the best kit on the market, is these simple studs right here that allow everything to bolt together just like the factory designed it. So we got that down, we go through and kind of check and see how everything's fitting everywhere, pull our wires back so that we'll be able to install them later, make sure nothing's in a bind anywhere, and that the kit sits all the way down. Alright, so don't make a novice mistake like we did. We're trying to get it down all the way. What we found is we turned these injectors the wrong way earlier whenever we're going over this kit. So spin all the injectors back to this side so that they're not hitting the cylinder head, and then this sits all the way down. Alright, so now those are all the way down. Each one of the injectors is clocked around, so we'll be able to plug our ASC harness on it here in just a moment. And we're good there. So the next thing we need to do is come down. We're going to find the factory fuel line. It's kind of buried up underneath all of this. We'll move some of this out of the way so we can see it and get to it. You can unplug the starter wire here just by pushing that tab down and pulling back. That's the signal wire. And now we can see the fuel line down here. Alright guys, so off camera we went ahead and hooked the fuel line up to the car. The reason we did it off camera is this particular car has a very unique, different setup for the fuel lines here, and so it was a lot more work. We had to remove the high pressure fuel lines and such in order to get everything out and loose and taken apart. On most vehicles you're going to have the factory quick connect. You still pinch it together, slide it off, ours snaps back on, and the factory line just pushes and snaps back onto it. So it's really quick and really easy. This one was pretty much a chore for us to get done. So what you can see here is how we've got it connected though. The green clips slide over, this whole fitting slides over, snaps in place. Once that's done, it can't come back off. And then we've got the lines routed and smooth radius coming up here, and you can see up in there that it's not around any sharp edges or anything that it can rub on. Just make sure that once you're done, get that starter plug back in. So with the starter plug back in and everything tied in, we're ready to go ahead and move on to start wiring up the AIC controller to each one of the injectors and getting things routed there, and then it's onto the manifold. Alright, so now for this next portion, we're going to be installing the AIC split-second controller on this car. So we went ahead and soldered up a longer ground wire on this controller earlier, and we're ready now to go ahead and start installing. So I like to sit the AIC just over out of the way. That gives me some free hands. This particular car has a catch can setup on it, so we want to try to route the wiring behind the catch can setup so that whenever he goes to remove any of this later, none of the wires are in the way. So just feeding the wires down from the back here and start pulling it down and getting it all around there. If you don't have a catch can set up, this portion's a lot easier, or if you do this on a fresh build that doesn't have any of the stuff on, you'd want to do this before doing your catch can. But as you can see, it's still not a real big deal to do. All right, so now with the wires ran around, we're going to just start at one end and start plugging in the injectors. And you just push them on until they click in place. And I plugged that one in the wrong order. So as you can tell, they're just all in a sequential order. And you start at one end of the harness and just work your way down to the other end of the harness. All right, now once the harness is all in and connected, we just come along and tidy things up, make it look prettier. I like to rotate each one of these injectors out of the way, just so that it's easy for me whenever I go to put the fuel rail on later, or excuse me, the intake manifold on later. I don't have anything that I'm struggling with or bumping into. Just gives a little extra clearance. All right, so we get that first one on there. All right, so now with all those on, everything's routed back behind here, nice and tight. Let's go ahead and cut those zip ties down to the right length so we don't have any tails hanging out. All right, so now we got the AIC wiring ran for underneath the intake manifold. Everything's plugged in, everything's nice and tight. The port injection rail, if I push on it, I can see that it touches all the way up against the cylinder head, so everything's good there. Just go back over, make sure if you undid any electrical connectors, that all those connectors are back in place, that everything's free and able to move, and we move on to the next portion of the install. All right guys, so now it's time to install the intake manifold. So for that, we're gonna go ahead and we loosened this earlier. We're gonna undo this line so we get a little more room to clear. And set that down for right now. We'll kind of hold it while we're installing the manifold. We still haven't installed that front stud. We can install it afterwards. It's my personal preference, as I mentioned earlier, to do it that way. So as you're doing this, just watch and make sure you're clear of all your lines. Come over here and put your wires for your O2 sensors and your vacuum lines around front. Once you get everything cleared up, it's just a matter of getting everything lined up and sliding it down. So everything's lined up now. I want to double check, make sure all those lines are cleared again, and then we're going to sit down. And we're slowly sliding down. I'm pushing up against some wiring here, and our bracket in the back here is hitting some factory looms, so we get that pulled out of the way. And everything's starting to sit down. Our inlet's pushed down under the manifold a little bit right now as well. We need to pull that up. All right, now that inlet is up, everything's down. We start filling around and trying to figure out anything else that can be interfering with this until we get it down the rest of the way. So don't feel anything interfering, so we may just need to lift up and kind of give it a little bit of a push and get it seated. There, it's just the angle. All right guys, so that was it. We just needed to lift up a little bit and get that seated. And now we go ahead and put some of the intake manifold nuts back on, starting with the OEM ones. Whenever we do that last stud in the front, we'll end up using the extra nut that was provided with the kit. So here, once again, you want to make sure that you don't drop anything. All right, we got that one extended stud left, our nut, and then the other factory nut. So I've got this factory nut here. I'll put this last one on, and I like to go ahead and kind of try to get the stud started, and then I tighten everything up and then finish out the stud. And the reason I like to start the stud first is right now everything can still wiggle and shift just a little bit, so if I needed to reposition it or something like that, I still could. It should line up pretty good, but we're good there. So I've got a few threads started. I can feel it. I can't pull it back out. So we know we're lined up in the hole. Let's go ahead and zap those down real quick. All right. So we'll go through and we'll snug all these up pretty good. And that last one, you can see I'm getting it, just barely catching it at an angle so it snags. That's why we don't want to sit here and torque this one. We'll come back and get that one by hand in a moment. Now with that on there, the next step is to get that other Torx that we have there at the very front. So we're going to switch back over to that E6 Torx that we're using and get everything situated here. Alright, so now that I got this E6 Torx, once again make sure that this thing was threaded good, go slow, and work it down into the head. Like that, we're going to snug it up pretty good. So that one's snugged up good and tight now. We can add that last nut on here. So something to point out for this nut, it is not an 11 millimeter nut. It's very close to an 11 millimeter, and you can use an 11 millimeter if you're not torquing it down. If you try to torque it with an 11, you will end up stripping it. This nut is going to be the only one that's going to be a 10 millimeter nut. So make sure that you swap back over and grab a 10 millimeter socket whenever you tighten this one up. Alright, so now we got the 10 mil on here. We got the nut started. So we're going to finish tightening that one down. So that one's good and tight. We're going to switch back to the 11 and we're going to torque everything down the rest of the way now. Alright, for that last one, we want to get in there with a ratchet. And then we also want to double check the tightness of each one of those as well. Never rely on machine tools for final torquing. Use them to get things tight, and then you want to come back. Torque specs are always a great thing to use, but you at least want to have the feel of what tight feels like, because you see some of these still had a lot of turn left in them. Alright, so we're going to switch back to that 10 mil, tighten that other one for the last time, and then move on to the rest of this. Alright, so with the intake manifold tightened back up on here, we check again to make sure all of our wires are good, make sure nothing's in the way. We can go ahead and start plugging upper sensors back in. O2s are good, none of the lines are pinched, everything's cleared. We can loop this back around for install. Probably go ahead and pop this heater wire off of there so we can route it back underneath like it's supposed to be. So now we're working on trying to hook this catch can back up to the inlets. This is a little bit of a pain because it's so flexible and like moves so much. But we'll get it seated down in there, tighten it up, and then call it a day for that. Alright, so now that we got the PCV set up for his catch can hooked back up and everything for the heater, we're going to plug the wiring back in for it. So we got that plugged in there. We need to come underneath here in that electronics box that we pulled off the brackets down here earlier. We're going to slip that back in and lock it back in place. So that's back on. We'll make sure everything else is kind of clear and out of the way. We'll take the throttle body. We'll plug this in first. Get everything situated with the electronics. Make sure we got it oriented the right way or it won't plug in. Alright, so we slide the connector on here and we pull until it clicks. Once that clicks, we push down on the charge pipe just a little bit to start working this throttle body back in between the two. Alright, I'm going to let the throttle body kind of be pushed up by the charge pipe there. we get our first bolt started. So for this process, you don't want to tighten anything down. You want to put everything in nice and loose so that you've got movement to be able to kind of get everything positioned. So you get your first bolt started. And go ahead and grab your other 3. We're basically putting it together in the reverse order of what we took it apart. All right, so now we got all 4 bolts tightened down finger tight. Next step in the process is grab our ratchet. All right, so we got our ratchet, we're in the tightening mode. Now we just start tightening this thing up. 1 bolt at a time. We aren't gonna torque it down, just snug. And we'll come back and do our final torque once we got all the others tightened down. All right, so we got all of them snug now. I'm gonna take and realign our charge pipe just a little bit. Actually, let me grab a little bit of that silicone lube. All right, so I just put a little dab of silicone lube on my finger and I just rub it around the whole seam of this. A lot of these that don't have catch cans and that sort of thing will have plenty of engine oil already all over them. So in those instances, you may not need any silicone lube, but as I mentioned earlier, silicone lube just kind of helps things go together and seat better. Oh, there it goes. All right, so now we got the charge pipe just kind of loosely on here and out of the way of our socket wrench. So I'm going to go ahead and come back now and start tightening all 4 of these bolts. I'm actually going to start with the rear ones first, since they're a little bit harder to get to. And as you tighten this, the opposing bolts on the opposite side will end up getting a little bit looser because things are tightening in, and so it's a little bit easier. All right, so that one's good and snug. Reach up underneath this vacuum line. Feel for the head of the bolt. And slip my ratchet over it. All right, that one's tight. That one's tight. One left. All right, so you saw there how easy that one was to spin. It even wants to spin backwards. That's what I was talking about, doing opposing sides. All right, so now we got all 4 of those in. Next step's going to be to slide the charge pipe up and put the clip on. Mistake a lot of people make is they install their charge pipe clips after their charge pipe is up. It's not correct. It's not how it was designed or intended. The correct way to do it is install the clip first and keep pushing on until you feel a positive or hear a positive click. All right, so we just need to get that charge pipe pushed up on there the rest of the way. If you heard those clicks, you know it's on there. So once the charge pipe's on, we got that throttle body vacuum we undid earlier. Reach in the very back, you'll feel a box with a rubber tab on it, and you'll feel the metal bracket it's supposed to slide onto. Don't worry so much about the front other than just watching it. And while you line up the front, fill the back, and slide that over that metal bracket back there. This one I've got something else in my hand. Here we go. And it locked on. We come back here, push this back up in, get it locked in place. Look and see what else we've got disconnected. We still got our map sensor disconnected. So pull the inlet back out of the way just a little bit. Plug the map sensor in, make sure it clicks in place. Get everything else positioned. All right, so we've got all of our wiring, looks good. All that looks like it's left here is just this blow-off valve line. I'm gonna cheat and make this a little bit easier on myself as well. Throw a little bit more lube on there so that it slips on nice and easy. These things are barbed, they don't come back off. So a little bit of silicone lube's not gonna hurt it. It's also never a bad idea to throw a little small zip tie on any of these lines, but this lube will end up getting absorbed into the silicone and it'll stay on there nice. This allows me to make sure I get it pushed all the way up on there. All right, so now we've got that on there. Everything looks good, nothing else disconnected. It's time to throw that air box back on there. All right, so this is a pretty unique little air box setup here. It won't go on exactly like factory, but it's similar. All of them are a little bit different. So, and some of you won't even have air boxes. You'll have the relocated inlets, which flow a little bit more and help you out there. So we got that out there, one here. Got to slide underneath from this side first and get those locked in as we slide onto the inlet. All right, we got 2 lined up. That looks like it's there. Get this inlet pulled back just a little bit and roped in here. All right, that's in there. The other one appears to be in. Pop that air box down. All we got left to do now is just tighten up a couple hose clamps. And then that is it. And we can move on to the AIC controller, getting it programmed and everything set up. All right, so now that I got the 8mm here, tighten these hose clamps down, do them first with the zip gun, and then we'll come back by hand and see how tight they really are. All right, so I got my ratchet wrench here. Go ahead and put a few more turns on these just so we can get a positive feel of how tight they are. They don't need to be torqued down. They're not holding any kind of boost pressure or anything like that. But you just want them tight enough to where you're not going to have anything come around and get any dirt or debris in your system. So with that done, all we got left to do is connect the line here over the top. Looks like it's a tight fit with this air box setup, but it still fits. And we'll reposition the camera and we'll throw the front inlet pipe back on, and then we'll move on to the AIC controller. All right, so now we just need to put this portion back in. To do that, we simply slide it up underneath, line it back up. And you'll feel it kind of line into the grooves. Take the screws and stick the screws through one at a time, tightening them in. I like to try to fill through here and make sure I got everything lined up. If not, you end up putting the screws beside the holes instead of actually in them. All right, we saw it pull up, so we know one of the screws is in. Do the same thing for the other side. Should be lined up pretty good now. All right, so that one's tightened down. And that one's tightened down. So everything's there. If you had a factory airbox, this would slide up over it and lock onto it. But with his setup, that's just kind of how it sits. So now that we got that done, we'll move on to that AIC controller.